They always told Superman he was the last son of Krypton, a lonely survivor, a man carrying extinction in his chest like a second heartbeat. He had accepted it long ago, built a life around it, learned to love a world that would never fully understand what it meant to be the only one left. Until one day, Krypton answered back. Not as a memory buried in crystal archives, not as a ghost whispering through his father's hologram, but alive, breathing, waiting in the darkness between stars where no telescope had ever looked. A hidden colony, a surviving planetary core, an entire civilization that had clawed its way through oblivion while he grew up in Kansas, unaware that his loneliness had always been a lie. They had been searching for him across decades of silence. And now they were dying again. Krypton's experimental sun was collapsing, its energy matrices failing one system at a time. The survivors had run every simulation, exhausted every alternative, watched every projection end the same way. Total extinction within months. Unless Kal-El returned, his biology carried something irreplaceable. Cells matured under a yellow sun, but still resonating with Kryptonian frequencies. A living bridge between what was lost and what might survive. The technology keeping their world intact required an anchor. Someone born of the old world who had evolved beyond it. Someone exactly like him. But the equations contained a truth no one wanted to speak aloud. If Superman chose Krypton, Earth would lose its guardian forever. The process that would stabilize his homeworld would bind him to its gravity, its dying red sun, its desperate need. He would remain Kal-El, but everything that made him Superman would fade like morning frost under rising heat. No more silent rescues in the night. No more red cape cutting through storm clouds. No more impossible hope arriving exactly when the world needed it most. Billions of humans would continue their lives, but afraid, always glancing upward at empty skies. Millions of Kryptonians would survive because one man chose to come home. For the first time in his existence, Superman was not choosing how to save everyone. He was choosing who deserved to be saved. And gods were never meant to carry that weight. The signal reached him above the Atlantic, sunlight washing over clouds that stretched toward every horizon. He felt it before he heard it, a vibration resonating through his chest like a frequency older than language. At first he dismissed it as memory playing tricks, another echo of grief surfacing without warning. But this was not memory. This was intelligence, clean and deliberate and unmistakably alive. Clark Kent froze mid-flight as the transmission resolved into meaning. Kryptonian symbols cascaded through his awareness, not warning him, not pleading with him, welcoming him home. The fortress of solitude transformed the moment he arrived. Crystalline structures shifting to process incoming data at speeds that would have melted human technology. Star maps materialized in the frozen air. Energy readings spiked and stabilized. Planetary scans assembled themselves into impossible confirmation. There it was, smaller than the Krypton of legend, scarred by whatever cataclysm had driven its survivors into hiding, but breathing, turning, filled with millions of lives that had endured while he mourned them from across the galaxy. Scientists and engineers and artists and children, all of them waiting for a son who never knew they existed. The message explained everything with devastating precision. Their son had been artificially sustained for generations, but the systems were failing beyond repair. The planetary core required a living Kryptonian presence to stabilize, someone whose cellular structure could interface with technology designed before his birth. The process would take months, perhaps years, but once complete, the bond would be permanent. Leaving would mean tearing Krypton apart from the inside. Kal-El would live, his people would live, but Superman would become a story Earth told its children about the Guardian who flew away and never returned. He stood motionless as futures rewrote themselves around him, every possibility branching into consequences he could not calculate. Earth had always been loud, chaotic, beautiful in its fragility, a planet that broke itself constantly and somehow kept choosing survival. Earth needed him, not because humanity was weak, but because it never stopped pushing against limits that should have destroyed it. And yet Earth had never been his birthplace. Krypton had given him life. Krypton had shaped the cells that made him extraordinary. Krypton had sent him across the void with hope encoded in his DNA. Now Krypton was asking him to come home and finish what his father started. The world noticed his distraction before anyone named it. Superman still caught the crashing airliner over the Pacific, passengers screaming until his hands steadied the fuselage. He still reinforced the collapsing bridge in Eastern Europe, steel groaning as he held weight that would have crushed mountains. He still smiled for cameras and knelt before children who reached for his cape like it was woven for miracles. But he lingered now, longer than necessary, looking at faces instead of threats, memorizing details he had always taken for granted. The way sunlight caught human hair, the sound of laughter that expected tomorrow to arrive, the ordinary courage of people who woke up every morning knowing they could break. Lois Lane watched him enter their apartment that evening, afternoon light pooling across floors they had chosen together. No alarms screaming through the city, no emergencies demanding his attention, just the two of them and the silence that had been growing between his words. She did not ask what was wrong. She simply waited, because waiting was something she had learned across years of loving someone who carried worlds on his shoulders. He told her everything, not quickly, not dramatically. He laid the truth between them like something fragile, watching her face as she understood what the signal meant, what the choice would cost, what staying on Earth would murder across the stars. She did not cry. She did not beg him to remain. She asked one question, her voice steady even as her hands trembled. If you leave, what happens to everyone here? He could not answer, because for the first time in his life, he did not know. Governments discovered the signal within hours. Energy signatures that powerful could not hide from satellites designed to watch the sky. Emergency sessions convened across continents. Intelligence agencies redirected resources. Military strategists asked the question that had haunted contingency planners for decades. What does Earth look like without its greatest protector? The simulations returned answers no one wanted to accept. Survivable, not safe, not peaceful, not hopeful in the way humanity had grown accustomed to feeling, but survivable. Casualties would rise. Response times would stretch. Threats that Superman handled alone would require armies and sacrifices and losses that could have been prevented. Humanity would endure, but it would endure afraid. Krypton's projections told a different story. Without Kal-El, there was no survival at all, just extinction delayed by months, every simulation ending the same way, millions of lives collapsing into the void because the one person who could save them chose to stay with strangers instead. Clark returned to the fortress alone, seeking counsel from the only Kryptonian voice he had ever known. His father's hologram activated with the same calm precision it had always carried, light assembling into features that existed only in memory and crystal matrices. "You were never meant to choose," Jor-El said. "You were sent to inspire, to show another world what Krypton could have become." Clark stared at the projection of a man who had made impossible choices decades before he was born. Inspiration does not stop a dying son. No, his father agreed. But sacrifice defines what inspiration truly means. Days passed while the signal weakened. On Earth, people began responding to something they could not name. Murals appeared on buildings overnight, artists painting red capes against blue skies, without knowing why the image felt urgent. Letters arrived at the watchtower from every continent, thank you notes and prayers and drawings from children who had never met Superman but somehow understood that gratitude was owed before it was too late. They were not asking him to stay. They were thanking him for arriving at all. Clark suspended himself above the planet one final time, floating in full daylight where the curve of Earth glowed beneath him like something precious and impossibly small. Every sound reached him simultaneously, heartbeats and arguments and laughter and the quiet breathing of people asleep in the afternoon. He realized what he had always known but never spoken. Earth did not need a god forever. It needed one long enough to learn how to stand alone. And Krypton needed a son to finally come home. He turned toward the stars, not as Superman, but as Kal-El. Earth felt his absence before anyone confirmed it. There was no announcement, no farewell carved into the sky with heat vision, no final press conference where Superman explained why he was leaving. He simply stopped responding the way he always had. Delays stretched from seconds to minutes. Emergencies resolved themselves or waited longer than they should have. The red streak that had defined safety for generations appeared less frequently until it stopped appearing at all. News anchors maintained composure while their voices tightened. Analysts filled broadcasts with speculation that sounded increasingly desperate. Social media erupted with fear disguised as humor, panic wrapped in memes, genuine terror hidden beneath performance. But beneath all the noise was the same question echoing across every continent. Where is Superman? Clark Kent still walked Earth streets, still breathed its air, still carried the weight of a choice that had not yet become permanent. The Fortress of Solitude had transformed from sanctuary to countdown, Krypton's signal pulsing weaker with every passing hour, each delay measured in lives that would not survive his hesitation. Governments activated protocols that had gathered dust in classified archives. Defense coalitions reformed overnight, old rivals becoming temporary partners because the alternative was unthinkable. Weapons programs that had been deemed too extreme found themselves reconsidered by committees that no longer had the luxury of caution. For the first time in decades, humanity confronted survival without a symbol to guarantee it. Batman's transmission was brief. No accusations, no emotional appeals. Just one question delivered with the precision of someone who had spent years preparing for this exact moment. How long do we have? Clark could not answer directly. He never could with Bruce. He said only what truth permitted. Less than they think. That was enough. Contingency plans activated within hours. The Watchtower shifted command structures that had remained static for years. Diana departed for Themyscira to rally alliances older than recorded history. Atlantean scouts expanded their patrols into waters they had avoided for centuries. Even villains noticed the changing atmosphere, crime rates hesitating rather than spiking because predators understood instinctively when the ecosystem was shifting. Fear moved faster than reason could contain it. Protests erupted across major cities. Some demanded Superman stay, placards painted with desperate pleas and accusations of abandonment. Others demanded he leave, arguing that Earth had grown dependent on a crutch it needed to discard. Religious movements fractured between those calling him savior and those naming him betrayer. Politicians delivered speeches about sovereignty and self-reliance, while privately asking the same question in secure rooms. Who protects us now? Clark moved through the chaos unseen, listening without responding, absorbing every argument because each one carried weight he could not dismiss. Fear was justified. Anger was justified. The contradiction of wanting him gone and needing him present was entirely, painfully human. That was the problem he could not solve. Krypton was more than a planet. It was a culture, a language, a history erased before it could be passed on. Earth possessed 8 billion voices shouting in every direction. Krypton had only echoes, and the one person who could transform echoes into future. And yet when a bridge collapsed in Sao Paulo, he was there before the first car hit water. When wildfire threatened to consume communities in Australia, he arrived before evacuation orders finished broadcasting. When a child slipped from a balcony in Cairo, his hands caught her before gravity completed its work. Because letting go did not mean abandoning responsibility. It meant carrying it until the final possible moment. Lois watched him return later each night, quieter than the man she had married, somehow stronger and heavier at once. She understood what he was attempting even before he admitted it to himself. You are trying to save both. He could not deny what they both knew was impossible. World leaders requested direct communication through secure channels. Faces from every continent appearing on screens, without pretense or political theater. No speeches designed for public consumption. No threats meant to leverage guilt. just honesty from people who had spent careers avoiding it. "We can adapt," one said. "We will lose millions," another admitted. "But humanity survives," a third concluded. They were not begging. They were giving him permission to leave. That terrified him more than anger ever could have. The simulation results leaked before anyone could contain them. Earth without Superman did not end. The projections showed something far more complex than extinction. It showed hardening, cities transforming into fortresses, space becoming militarized faster than anyone had planned, trust shrinking between nations that had learned to cooperate only because cooperation was cheaper than competition. Humanity survived in every simulation. But the idea of hope as something external, something embodied in a figure who arrived when darkness seemed absolute, disappeared from the projections entirely. People stopped looking up. Clark read the final analysis and closed his eyes. Hope was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to be inherited. Krypton's message changed 2 days before his departure. The scientific precision that had characterized previous transmissions cracked under emotional weight. Voices overlapped in ways that suggested genuine urgency. Children appeared on screens, faces that could have belonged to cousins he would never know. Elders stood beside them, showing him what had survived across generations of hiding. Art that had been preserved despite everything. Music that still carried melodies from a world he had only seen in crystals. Stories passed from parents to children to grandchildren, each telling slightly different, each keeping something alive that should have died. This is not a demand, the message concluded. It is an invitation. Come home if you can. Come home if you choose. But know that we will understand if the choice is impossible. The weight did not lessen, but the nature of the weight transformed. This was not a choice between planets. It was a choice between past and future, and both were asking him to bleed. The Justice League gathered without ceremony in a space that had hosted countless strategic sessions. No table between them this time. No arguments about tactics or resources. Just truth shared between people who had fought beside each other long enough to abandon pretense. Diana spoke first. "We will manage." Barry attempted a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "We always do." Bruce said nothing. His silence carried more meaning than words could have provided. When Clark departed the watchtower, the sky held no drama, clear and bright and ordinary. The kind of day that would never appear in history books because nothing about it seemed significant. He positioned himself above the atmosphere one final time, Earth rotating slowly beneath him. Every feature he had memorized across decades of protection visible in the afternoon light. Every instinct developed across a lifetime of heroism screamed at him to stay, to hover forever in this moment, to delay until the choice became unnecessary. But choice was precisely the point. Krypton's signal had faded to something barely detectable, a thread of hope stretched across light years and growing thinner by the hour. And Earth continued spinning without pause. Clark drew one final breath of yellow sun warmth and felt power answer through every cell, strong and familiar and reliable in ways he had always taken for granted. Not forever. He turned away from the world that had raised him, not because Earth had failed him, but because it finally did not need him to be its god. And somewhere in the darkness between galaxies, a broken world waited for something it had lost long ago. Not a savior, a son. The change began the moment Superman crossed beyond Earth's gravitational influence. Nothing dramatic, no sudden weakness collapsing him in the void. Just a quiet shift, subtle as gravity loosening its ancient grip. The yellow sun still powered him across distances that would have killed anything else, but the connection had begun thinning. Every mile between himself and Earth stripped away strength he had never questioned. He felt something he had not experienced since childhood. Mortality. The corridor ahead glowed with artificial light as Kryptonian technology activated. Systems dormant for generations, recognizing his presence and responding. The path to the hidden world opened through space, like a wound healing in reverse, showing him the way home. For the first time since Krypton's destruction, Kal-El was not traveling as a refugee. He was returning as something his people had never dared to hope for. As he approached the planet, the scale of survival became visible through every spectrum his vision could access. The surface carried scars that would never fully heal, fractured continents held together by energy lattices humming at frequencies designed before his birth. Cities had been built downward instead of outward, protection valued over expansion. Oceans were regulated with precision that spoke of resources measured in generations rather than years. This Krypton was not proud. It was not the arrogant civilization that had ignored warnings until apocalypse consumed it. This Krypton was cautious, humble, terrified of repeating mistakes that had cost it everything. And yet it was alive. The moment he entered orbit, the planet responded in ways his instruments barely registered. Energy readings that had been declining for months stabilized. Atmospheric systems that had been failing strengthened. The artificial sun that should have collapsed within weeks shifted just enough to extend his life. Not solved, held. Because he was there, millions of Kryptonians watched the sky as he descended through atmosphere that tasted like home. Faces turned upward without cheering, without kneeling, without the worship Earth had sometimes offered. They were staring at something they had almost stopped believing could exist. Proof that what they had lost had not vanished completely. When his feet touched Kryptonian soil for the first time since infancy, something inside him broke open. The gravity felt correct in ways Earth's never had. Heavy in a manner his bones recognized from before memory. His heartbeat synchronized with the planet's deep rhythms, as if he had never left. The language surrounding him required no translation because understanding was woven into cells that had formed in this world's wombs. Every symbol, every sound, every scent unlocked memories he had not known he carried. Kal-El was not remembering Krypton. Krypton was remembering him. The council received him without ceremony in chambers that bore no resemblance to the grand halls of legend. These were survivors, scientists and elders, and ordinary citizens who had endured long enough to lead when no one else remained. Their faces carried endurance rather than authority, patience rather than pride. They did not thank him. They did not apologize. They explained. The planetary core could achieve permanent stability, but only through bonding its energy matrix to a living Kryptonian whose cells had adapted to dual-star exposure. His biology had evolved under yellow solar radiation while retaining the fundamental resonance of Krypton's red frequencies. He was the bridge no equation could replicate, no technology could simulate, no sacrifice could replace. The process would be irreversible. Once his cellular structure integrated with the planetary systems, leaving Krypton would destabilize everything the bond had strengthened. He would be tearing his world apart from the inside. He would live. The planet would live. But Earth would lose Superman permanently. He asked the question he had been avoiding since the first signal reached him. What happens to your world if I do not stay? The answer came without dramatics, without manipulation, without anything except the weight of truth. We die. Over the following days, Kal-El walked the cities his people had built from desperation and hope. No cape marked him as different. No symbol set him apart. He was simply a man learning the weight of belonging to something larger than himself. Children followed him through streets, curious but unafraid, asking questions about the distant world where he had grown up. Elders shared stories of a civilization he had only known through crystals and holograms, filling gaps in his understanding with details no archive could capture. Art survived here in forms he had never imagined. Refined and restrained, shaped by loss into something more profound than Krypton's golden age had ever produced. There were no statues of him anywhere. That absence hurt more than he expected, though he could not explain why. On Earth, his disappearance had stopped being theoretical. A meteor struck the Pacific Ocean with force that would have been trivial once. Now it required international coordination. Navies and aircraft and emergency responders from 12 nations working together, while casualties mounted. The world mourned what could have been prevented. But the world did not break. That was the confirmation Clark had dreaded most. They were surviving without him. Messages reached Krypton through channels that should not have been possible. Signals bounced across relay stations humanity had not known existed. Not demands for his return, not desperate pleas for salvation. Progress reports, adaptation updates, proof that Earth was learning to carry its own weight. Batman sent one final transmission through a frequency only 2 people in existence knew. Do what you need to do. We will handle the rest. Clark stared at those words long after the message ended, feeling something shift in his chest that might have been grief or might have been gratitude. On Krypton, the planet strengthened with every hour he remained. Skies that had been perpetually dim began showing hints of color. Infrastructure that had been failing for generations stabilized enough to permit maintenance rather than constant emergency repair. Birth rates that had been declining for decades increased for the first time since the Exodus. For the first time in generations, Kryptonians began planning more than 1 year ahead. Hope returned to his homeworld, not the kind that needed a symbol in the sky, the kind that grew from trust in tomorrow. The final ceremony was not public. No crowd gathered. No speeches echoed through grand halls. Just Kal-El standing before the council in the core chamber, an impossible structure of light and gravity that represented the heart of everything his people had preserved. Exposed, failing, waiting. As he stepped into the binding field, the last reserves of Yellow Sun's strength flickered through him. Earth felt distant now in ways that had nothing to do with physics. Like a dream remembered through decades of waking, beautiful but belonging to someone else's life. The process began. Energy wrapped around him, not attacking his cells, but connecting them to systems larger than any individual. Every part of his biology responded, rewriting itself to anchor a world instead of merely walking upon it. Pain followed, not physical, something deeper, something that could not be numbed or ignored. Memories surged through him with terrible clarity. Kansas wheat, fields golden under afternoon sun. Lois laughing at something he had said, her voice the most beautiful sound in any galaxy. Wind rushing past him as he flew, the weightlessness of being more than human, more than mortal, more than possible. He let it go, all of it, because holding on would destroy everything he was trying to save. When the light faded and the binding completed, Krypton stabilized around him. The artificial sun burned steady for the first time in decades. The planetary core strengthened. Systems that had been failing for generations began healing themselves. The planet lived. Kal-El collapsed, not from weakness, but from transformation. He could still move mountains if mountains needed moving, still outrray sound if speed were required. But the sky no longer called to him the way it once had. The urge to fly, to leave, to answer every cry for help across the cosmos, had quieted into something manageable. He stood in his homeworld's gravity and felt complete, not as Superman, not as a visitor pretending to belong, but as something older and quieter and finally at peace. On Earth, children stopped drawing a man in a red cape saving the day. They started drawing themselves instead. And across the stars, a planet long believed dead began a new chapter, powered not by a god's impossible strength, but by a son who chose to stay. The universe did not end when Superman remained on Krypton. That surprised nearly everyone. There was no cosmic punishment for the choice, no chain reaction of disasters proving Earth had been abandoned wrongly. Reality did not collapse simply because one hero stepped out of the sky. Instead, something quieter happened, something far more uncomfortable for those who had believed protection required protectors. The universe adjusted. The first year without Superman rewired humanity's collective instincts. There was no red blur to catch mistakes anymore. Every decision carried weight that could not be transferred to someone else. Every delay produced consequences that had to be absorbed rather than prevented. The margin for error that Superman had represented shrank to nothing, and people felt the absence in their daily calculations. Heroes worked harder because they had to. The Justice League transformed from backup into primary defense. thinking as guardians rather than support. Wonder Woman took on diplomacy and warfare simultaneously, standing between nations that no longer trusted any power they could not verify. Flash became first responder everywhere at once, burning through exhaustion because slowing down meant casualties. Aquaman sealed borders beneath the oceans. Green Lantern patrolled deeper into space than protocols had ever required, because someone had to watch the darkness. Batman changed most visibly. Without Superman as the ceiling of possibility, Bruce became the line that could not be crossed. He expanded networks across every continent, trained successors in methods he had hoped would never need passing on, prepared humanity for threats he had once prayed would never arrive during his lifetime. He did not smile more often, but he slept even less. Villains tested the new silence. Some struck hard, believing fear would rule when the god overhead was gone. Most failed, not because Earth had found a Superman replacement, but because it had found something more dangerous: resolve. Humanity stopped assuming someone else would arrive to fix the problem. Cities reinforced themselves with technology that had been theoretical during Superman's tenure. Space defense programs accelerated beyond any projection. Young metahumans trained earlier and harder, without any illusion of safety waiting to catch their mistakes. The age of miracles ended. The age of responsibility began. And yet loss lingered in ways that could not be calculated. There were moments when the sky felt too empty, sunsets that seemed to ask where he had gone, silences during disasters that stretched just long enough for everyone to remember what had been lost. On Krypton, Kal-El learned what permanence truly meant. Staying did not make him a king. Krypton had buried monarchical ambitions with its old world. He was a stabilizer, an anchor, a living constant in a civilization terrified of repeating the arrogance that had destroyed it once before. Every system, every expansion plan, every scientific experiment accounted for one unspoken reality. If he fell, Krypton fell with him. That weight followed him through every day. He taught classes in history that had nearly been erased. He listened to debates about futures that previous generations had not dared imagine. He learned what his people had become during the decades without him, and what they might become now that he was present. Kryptonians no longer sought domination or perfection. They valued restraint above ambition, sustainability above expansion, memory above progress. They built upward again, slowly, carefully, testing every step before committing. There were nights Kal-El stood beneath the red sun and felt yellow sun power whispering from across the void. Not temptation, nostalgia. Earth still called to him in quiet frequencies, news transmissions and cultural archives, and recordings of laughter that belonged to another life. Lois sent letters, not pleas for his return, stories about people adapting without depending on miracles, about children growing up in a world where Superman was history rather than expectation, about hope becoming something taught rather than something given. He read every word, then committed each one to memory. And then the test arrived. A threat older than either world emerged from depths of space that had never been mapped, an intelligence that fed on planetary cores, consuming civilizations as fuel for purposes no one understood. It bypassed Earth entirely, not because Earth was insignificant, but because Krypton now burned brighter in spectrums the entity could detect. The League detected the approach too late to intercept before it reached Kryptonian space. Earth could have used Superman then. Everyone knew it. Every Kryptonian knew it. The Council gathered in emergency session. The mathematics were brutally simple. Kal-El could leave long enough to engage the entity directly, drawing on reserves of power that Krypton's red sun could not fully suppress. But doing so would destabilize the planetary core. Millions would die during his absence. The planet would survive, barely, but everything they had rebuilt would be set back by generations. He could save Earth again, once, and doom his people in the process. The silence following that calculation was heavier than any chain forged in any universe. Kal-El did not ask for advice from those who could not share the weight. He made his choice. Krypton activated defensive systems that had never been tested in combat. Not to stop the threat, because stopping it was beyond their capability, but to protect the core while Kal-El remained, buying time through sacrifice rather than power. Earth fought without him. The battle was brutal in ways that would haunt survivors for generations. Costly in lives that could have been saved, imperfect in execution and coordination. But they won, not cleanly, not heroically, together. When the threat was finally destroyed, the universe adjusted its calculations. Earth was not protected by a god. Krypton was not powered by arrogance. Two worlds had grown beyond what they had been when they needed each other. Separated by light years, united by consequence. Kal-El watched the stars that night, realizing something that would have terrified the young man who had first put on the cape. He was no longer the center of the story, and that was exactly as it should be. Superman had been a symbol of hope arriving from outside. Kal-El had become something rarer, proof that even legends must choose where they belong and live with the weight of choosing. The universe did not need a savior forever. It needed worlds willing to stand without one. Years passed, not quietly, but steadily, each one building upon the last. Earth stopped measuring time by disasters. Without Superman, crises no longer defined eras the way they once had. Progress defined them instead. Cities rebuilt smarter than before. Nations argued less about who would save them and more about how to save themselves. The sky was still watched by those who remembered, but it was no longer worshipped by those who had grown up in its absence. Superman became a story parents told their children before sleep, not as a warning against hubris, not as a myth too perfect to believe, as a lesson that could be carried forward. Hope is not something you wait for. Hope is something you become. On Krypton, time felt different, slower, heavier, measured in generations rather than emergencies. Kal-El aged, barely visible change by barely visible change, but enough to notice transformation in others. Children he had met grew into adults. Adults became elders. Cities expanded outward again, cautiously optimistic about futures that had seemed impossible when he arrived. Krypton did not rush its future anymore. It respected what the future represented. And Kal-El endured. He refused every title they offered: king, protector, savior. He lived among his people as one of them, taught their history to students who had never known how close they came to extinction, trained explorers who would someday venture beyond their solar system, mediated conflicts when logic alone failed. His presence was constant, but never dominant. Krypton survived not because he ruled, but because he stayed. Sometimes he dreamed of flying, not the kind that shattered sound barriers or chased missiles across continents. Just drifting, floating above wheat fields that no longer existed, feeling wind that had never touched Kryptonian air. He would wake beneath the red sun, grounded by a planet that needed him precisely where he was, and the dreams would fade into gratitude. Earth sent fewer messages as years became decades, not because they had forgotten, because they no longer needed permission to continue living. When contact did come, it arrived differently than before. Cultural exchanges between worlds that had learned to respect each other's evolution. Scientific collaboration that benefited both civilizations. Children from Earth visiting Krypton, eyes wide at alien skies, asking questions that would have seemed impossible when Superman still patrolled their world. Kryptonian students studying human history, learning how a fragile species discovered it could stand without a god watching overhead. Two worlds learning from each other, not leaning. The day Kal-El finally felt old, he understood what he had truly surrendered. Not power, immortality. Earth would move forward without him. New heroes would rise to face threats he would never see. New symbols would replace old ones until he became footnote rather than legend. And that was precisely how it was supposed to be. But Krypton would remember. Not Superman. Not the symbol Earth had needed when it was young. Kal-El, a man who chose responsibility over legend. When his strength finally began fading, The change came gradually rather than dramatically. Systems adjusted around him. Successors assumed positions he had spent decades preparing them for. Krypton had learned through his example not to anchor survival to any single being. That was his final lesson. On Earth, a museum opened in Metropolis on the anniversary of his departure. No statue outside the entrance, just an empty space where visitors could stand and look upward through glass into the sky. The plaque beside the space read simply, "He taught us we could stand." Children visiting did not ask why the space was empty. They understood. Kal-El's final act was not a battle, not a sacrifice wrapped in fire and witnessed by millions. It was trust. Trust that Earth would continue without him. Trust that Krypton would never repeat the arrogance that had destroyed it. Trust that hope did not require a face to exist. When he passed, Krypton did not mourn him as an ending. They celebrated him as completion. And somewhere in the vast quiet between stars, the universe balanced itself around something larger than heroism. The understanding that even the strongest among us must eventually choose where they belong, and then learn to let go. Superman did not save everyone forever. He showed everyone how to save themselves.